Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel. And if you are like me, just got a brand new full frame mirrorless Canon camera and the new lenses is way too expensive for you, you basically have two choices. A second-hand AF lens, the EF, the old system, with a cheap adapter, not the Canon one, that's way too expensive, or just one lens to do it all, the 240 millimeters. That is Canon AR. By the same price of the brand new 240 millimeters, you can buy these two beautiful lenses in the used market. So the 24-70 f4 with image stabilization and the 70-200 f2.8 with no stabilization. Also, you can find the f4 version a little bit cheaper and maybe with image stabilization or not, but I like to have a little bit more aperture, that's why I have this one. And to finalize, a third-party manufacturer adapter from AF lens to RF mount. This one is the JJC adapter that has no glass on it, so we won't compromise on the lens quality. But it will, however, compromise a little bit on the weather seal, I think. Canon adapter is just ridiculously expensive. So these two lenses has the fixed max aperture, so that means that through its zoom range it has the same maximum aperture. Now these two lenses are heavy, especially the 70-200, but they feel like tanks. And from my experience, they are. In the filter department, both these lenses use the 77 millimeters filters, and that's all that I have to say about that. The 24-240 RF is very light for its size, and may I just say that it doesn't come with a lens hood for some reason, Canon. So JJC again for the rescue. A dish heavier than the 24-17 millimeters. As aperture goes, it starts at f4 in 24 millimeters and 70 millimeters f5.6 and around 200 millimeters because it doesn't have the pointer of 200 millimeters. Around 200 millimeters, it closes down to its maximum aperture, f6.3, and it stays there all the way to 240 millimeters. So not a really fast lens, okay? The filter diameter is 72 millimeters. And it has a really cool trick. The traditional focus ring is smart, so you can program it on the camera to do other stuff like aperture control and something like that. I personally like to use it to exposure compensating, and it's so handy. I love it so much. So if you want to use that feature on the AF lenses, Canon has an adapter that doesn't cost 200, it costs 400, that has that ring as well, but 400 buckies, you have to sell an arm to buy that, okay? It feels solid, but not as solid as the 70-200. It feels a little bit plasticky, okay? I have mixed feelings about this lens. Until recently, the unique equivalent is the 28-300 shotgun action, more than 1.5 kilograms of a beast lens, which really we can't compare. But an all-around lens from Canon, that's it. Better late than ever. Let's tackle the quality. At 24 millimeters, the AF lens performs brilliantly with almost no visible vignetting, no visible chromatic aberration, but is expected from an f10 aperture. The RF, however, is bad, very bad. The vignetting looks terrible, that it looks like you are looking through a toilet roll paper, and the chromatic aberration is visible without zooming in on the image. The Lightroom corrections, the one-click default one, makes this lens close to what the 24-70 AF lens look like with no corrections, which are very acceptable. For now on, I will compare these lenses with different zooms and wide open, so f2, f4, f whatever it can, okay? Now, it isn't really fair comparing sharpness from different apertures, but the correct thing should be to stop down the fastest lens, but let us give a chance to the 24-200 millimeters, yes? So, 24 millimeters, both have f4, the center is sharp, but in the corners the AR isn't great. Get used to it, this will become a trend. At minimum, f22, both are poop. Jumping at 70 millimeters, the max aperture in the 24-70 is f4, which beats the 70-200 at f2.8 in the corners. But if I reduce to f4 that lens, they are indistinguishable. But the 24-240 at 70 millimeters wins with the sharp edges against the 70-200 millimeters. But the max aperture from that lens is f5.6. If I reduce the aperture of the 70-200 AF from 2.8 to f5.6, you know what? Let's not do that. Let's leave this win for this lens. Let it win something today, okay? At around 200 millimeters, the RF lenses at f6.3 has a bit of fight, but that eventually loses badly at the edge against the AF 70-200 at f2.8. But at 240 millimeters, the RF is alone. It's time to shine? No. The details are non-existent in wide open, and closing a bit the aperture is a bit better, but we can't call that sharp, okay? Image stabilization is so confused, but luckily with these three lenses I can explain each scenario, and probably someone will correct me on the comments as well. IS is described as image stabilization, usually an optic lens that stabilizes on AF lenses. IBIS is in-body image stabilization, which means that the sensor it's moving around to stabilize in 5-axis the image, okay? Works also if you don't have IS on the lens. Now, in-body image stabilization from the new Canon cameras works with the old AF lens. That means that the optical stabilization will work combined with the in-body image stabilization. But it can be combined as well with the RF lenses, of course they are brand new, combined with the optical and the in-body image stabilization, a super mega stabilization, all the way up to 8 stops. Not all lenses have that, but yeah, it's a crazy image stabilization. Hopefully that makes any sense. Let's test each scenario, okay? To start, the 24-70 millimeters at 70 millimeters, that it has the traditional image stabilization. In the case of an AF lens with an image stabilization, the IBIS will assist as well. Now, the AF lens that has IS knob on it, the IBIS is controlled by that as well, not on the menu. And of course, in the menu, the option isn't grayed out with an explanation. No, it just disappears. That doesn't help much, Canon. It's not on the menu because you control the IBIS and the image stabilization by this knob over here, okay? But it isn't too hard to put that grayed out option on the back on the menu and just say, well, control on that switch over there. It's not difficult, Canon, okay? If the lens IS is on, the IBIS is on. If it's off, the IBIS is off as well. Both of them will work together or nothing at all. Okay, now the test, and I went up to half a second. That is mind-blowing. The half a second is impressive, okay? Now, the 24-240 millimeters RF lens has a stabilizer switch, so as well the AF lens IBIS is controlled by that as well, not in the menu, which is invisible. Again, IBIS and optical stabilization are linked together. You cannot separate them. Now, how did the RF24240 at 70 millimeters? Not half a second, not 1 second, but 2 freaking seconds. Handheld 2 seconds of exposure, ladies and gentlemen. So that icon gives it a clue that plus there is for something. This less than $900 lens is on the elite IBIS and stuff. That gives 6.5 stop of benefit. So I think now is a good time to explain the stop benefit. In the lens world that doesn't have image stabilization and at any source, a good rule to avoid blurred image is to use the same zoom millimeters in the shutter speed or faster. In the case of, for example, 70 millimeters, is a good idea to use 1/17 second of stop to avoid blurred image. So the stop benefit is how much time you can put on the shutter speed. If it's 2 stops, you could go from 70 to 35 to 17th of a second. But on my control test with the IS and no IBIS, I got 50 to 30 of a second sharp image. How? Haha, you see, I am an old school photographer, and as an old school photographer, I photograph with 3 points of contact. 1, 2, 3, okay? And the correct position gives it less vibration. I call it MyBIS, okay? The underdog of image stabilization is the AF 7200 millimeters, which doesn't have any image stabilization whatsoever. But it can benefit from IBIS, and it can be deactivated on the menu Shoot 7 if you want to shut down the IBIS for this lens. So the AF 7200 millimeters only using the IBIS and the MyBIS got half of a second like the 2470 AF. We are touching the IBIS on lenses that doesn't have IS. For example, my 15 millimeters doesn't have any contacts on the back, so no image stabilization, so the camera has no idea what lens is attached to it. But I can benefit from IBIS as well. On the Shoot 7 menu, you can select the correct focal length and benefit from the IBIS as well, okay? Now, let's do the 200 millimeters, starting with the big champion of image stabilization, the 24-240 millimeters. Half a second sharp, a second sharp, a second, no, not sharp, so half a second, okay? Not bad, not bad at 200 millimeters. The AF 7200 got an impressive 1/15 of a second, and finally at 240 millimeters, I'm too lazy to do that test. These lenses can't keep up with the extra 40 millimeters, so the image stabilization winner looks to be the 240 millimeters, but the monster of IBIS on Canon unleashed is impressive. I had to add the ND1000 filter to make this test, thinking this is getting way too stupid. But now I'm like, I will do freaking long exposures without a tripod on trails of waterfalls. That's crazy. But let's make some math, okay? Not drug mathematic stuff, okay? Imagine that I am zooming at 200 millimeters using 200 ISO. The RF24-400 millimeters goes all the way up to f6.3, and my shutter speed is getting sharp at 500 of a second because it has 6.5 stops of benefit, okay? Imagine as well that I am in photographing a 4x4 racing, okay, or something like that. The 70-200 millimeters AF just can't keep up. Well, from 6.3 up to 2.8 is 2 1/3 stop. So roughly plus 2 stops of IBIS, at least 4 1/3 stops. That is not that far. I just need 2 1/3 stop, and I can get it easily by pushing a little bit the ISO to 1000 ISO. Okay, so yeah, there you go. And the sharpness, we saw the sharpness on this lens is not really the best thing. Okay, so focus test. In the focus test, I'm going to fast forward which lens is the fast, because it's so fast focusing that actually I don't see any difference. I had to make a collaboration with some Laowa guys to see any difference of time between all these lenses, okay? I had the feeling that the 24-240 had a little bit of a hard time to focus in the dark, but eventually it nailed the focus. But yeah, the focus point, the nearest focus point, the 24-240 millimeters has a really good near point to focus, but the 24-70 millimeters can actually cheat because it has an impressive macro mode that you can activate it by zooming in and pushing this thing, and you are in macro mode. This mode, you can really get close enough for be forced to remove the sun hood and really focus extremely near. That's really, really cool. So stabilization for video, I will test every single lenses in 70 millimeters where all the lenses meet. Also, I am forced to use the shutter on 180 degrees. Here is a sample with the lens with IS and IBIS off, just as a reference. I was walking backwards, holding the camera in front of me with no third point of contact. At 7 millimeters is aggressive. This is the 24-70 millimeters AF. It's looking okay compared to no stabilization, as it has the assistance of the IS incorporated with the IBIS. The big and heavy white 70-100 millimeters AF has only the IBIS to help, but it's not as good as the 24-70, of course. These strange jumps are a bit distracting, honestly. It works really well for photography, but for video, no optical stabilization, it's not good enough as the lens image stabilization. Now, the big winner, the 24-240 millimeters RF, is amazing. Just for fun, zooming to 240 millimeters, the footage looks like this. Very, very impressive. To test the focus of these lenses, I will use animal eye tracking from Canon, activated on the R6, and the focus shift, where I tap on the screen to refocus between two planes, okay? The big 70-100 millimeters is trying its best, but it's struggling. We can hear the focus motor going wild, but nailing the focus is great, but keeping it, focus shift is pumping, it's a pumping noise, and from the motors of focusing, and a lot of hesitation and not a perfect focus sometimes. That's not good. So another AF, the 24-70 millimeters, is better, as it has much recent lens and it has image stabilization, not noisy as the big white, but working well. But the winner is clearly the 24-140 millimeters. One of the hardest things to focus is walk back from the subject, or the subject walks in front directly of the camera, but this lens is impressive in its keeping up. I cannot say that is that consistent with the other two lenses. So the frames per second. Unfortunately, we cannot on this lens use the 12 frames per second that the R6 can do because of these lenses, because it needs a special lens to do that, and these cannot. In conclusion, it's hard to say buy this or do that or this or that, but any of these combinations can't go wrong. For me, the image quality on the beginning and at the end of the zoom range was so bad on the 24-240mm that I just can't accept it. It lacks good aperture that tries to compensate with an impressive image stabilization, okay, for video that is awesome, but if you already have at least one of these lenses and a $50 third-party AF to RF adapter, you can't go wrong. I bought this lens by second hand, for example, and it was around 500 euros, so impressive price for a 2.8 lens. Now I have another complaint, is the way the RF back-mounted works, because you really have to nail this thing to close. I found that the AF lenses, you just can put almost in any position and it will close down, because it has 3 ways to get in and lock the lenses. No problem. This one, I guess it only has, it has a 3 entries, I think, but it only works sometimes. I find this way easier. Now I'm just being picky, but I found the AF lenses is way easier to just close it down. The RF is not that easy sometimes, okay? But the big advantage of this 24-240mm RF lens is to avoid to change lenses. In the day that I made these tests, it was very, very windy, and I was so annoyed to have to change between these 3 lenses. And I didn't want to get any dust in the sensor. Although when you shut down the R6, it closes the shutter curtain, but I had some dust that fall out on the sensor and I have to clean it. And there you go. What about you guys? Which combination of lens would you choose? Honestly, if you already have one of these 2 lenses, especially the 70-200, you can't go wrong just buying a cheap adapter and you have a really nice lens, okay? The 24-240 are a good kit lens, but it's harder to accept all the defects that it has, but it's extremely handy. And that's mainly it. No need to change a lot the lenses to have a good zoom range, etc. For video, it's an excellent lens, but yeah, for photography, I'm gonna use most of the time these, and these, well, to day-to-day lens on tracks or somewhere that I don't want to carry a lot of heavy weight on my back. This lens can get really handy. There you go. Well, everyone, drop a like if you learned something, comment down below if you have any questions, and subscribe if you want to see more stuff like this. I am Miguel. Till next time, see ya.